Welcome to the online lecture for Chapter 4. You should use the information in this chapter to complete the guided notes for Chapter 4. This lecture covers all of the information for the entire chapter, so this one isn't split into parts. In this lecture, we're going to talk about three major topics. First, we're going to talk about carbon, and we're going to discuss why it is so important and so common in the molecules of living things. Second, we're going to discuss some molecules known as functional groups. And last, we're going to talk about some molecules known as isomers. You may have heard of life on Earth as being referred to as carbon-based life. And that's true. Carbon is at the center of most of the molecules that make up our cells and our bodies, these things we call organic molecules. So that begs the question, why carbon? Why aren't we aluminum-based life or neon-based life or something like that? Well, carbon has all of the right characteristics for making organic molecules. First of all, it's pretty small. Carbon has an atomic number of 6, which means it has 6 protons and 6 electrons, and it happens to have 6 neutrons too. Because it has 6 electrons, that means it has 4 valence electrons, and that means that it needs 4 more valence electrons to meet the octet rule. This means that a carbon can make 4 bonds. You see that here in methane. This carbon is connecting to 4 separate hydrogen atoms, so it's making 4 bonds and meeting the octet rule. So because carbon is small and because it can make 4 bonds, that makes it very, very versatile. So it can, molecules that include carbon can take on a number of different shapes. Here we see carbon making 4 single covalent bonds. This molecule includes only single bonds, but the 2 carbons are connecting together, making a chain. Here we see it making a double bond. So molecules that include carbon can have many different shapes and many different arrangements, and that makes carbon very, very versatile. Over here on the right, we have a whole bunch of organic molecules that include carbon as the basis. On the right, we have a whole bunch of carbon-based molecules. In other words, they have a carbon backbone, or we call them organic. And just look at all the different kinds of shapes of molecules that you can make using carbon as the backbone. Here we have some molecules that have double bonds between their carbons. Here's a really long chain of carbons all linked together. Here we have a chain that branches made of carbons. And here we even have some structures made of rings of carbon. So again, carbon is really, really versatile because it can make those 4 bonds. And because of that, you can make lots of different molecules with lots of different shapes out of carbon. Molecules can be classified in one of 2 categories. We either consider them organic or inorganic. Organic molecules all have 2 components minimally, carbon and hydrogen together. Another word for organic molecules are hydrocarbons. Inorganic molecules may include carbon, but if they don't also have hydrogen, we consider them inorganic. Now, organic molecules may contain other atoms as well. They can have oxygen and nitrogen, sulfur, for instance, but minimally, carbon and hydrogen has to be there. Here's an example of a fatty acid. It's an organic molecule, and look at all the carbons and hydrogens all over the place. Definitely organic. Here are a couple of examples of inorganic molecules, water and carbon dioxide. Now, just because molecules are inorganic, it doesn't mean they aren't important to life. Water, of course, is essential to life, and CO2 is a byproduct of our metabolism. We make CO2 all the time. It's just that they're in a different category. Here's your first year turn. I'd like you to examine these different molecules and tell me whether they are organic or inorganic. Write your answers down and bring them to class. Next, we're going to discuss something known as functional groups. Functional groups are small molecules that we typically find attached to larger molecules, such as a carbon backbone. Each functional group has certain characteristics and properties, and when they are attached to a larger molecule, they lend that larger molecule their properties, so they can affect how they behave. Here's a great example. Here we have estrogen and testosterone. These are two chemicals I am sure you've heard of before. Now you know that estrogen and testosterone can behave very differently inside a human body, but structurally they're very, very similar. They're both made of 4 large carbon-based rings, and really the only thing that makes them different from one another are the functional groups that are attached. Testosterone has a CH3 group, something called a methyl attached here, and something called a carbonyl attached over here, whereas estrogen has something called a hydroxyl attached here. And those tiny differences account for all the big differences in behavior that we know exist between these molecules. So functional groups can be very powerful. These are the 7 functional groups I would like you to know. We're going to go through them one at a time, but I would like you to be able to recognize with a diagram, and you should also know their characteristics. You'll find a chart on the guided notes that will help you summarize the information you need to know about the functional groups. As you work your way through the following slides, I suggest that you fill in any missing information, make a drawing of each functional group, and tell me which larger molecules we would find these functional groups attached to. You'll see the letters R and X used to replace some of the atomic symbols on the following diagrams. So what are those about? Well, in chemistry, R's and X's are wildcards. That means that this little molecule is attached to something, but we don't know what. It could be anything. And it's just an abbreviated way of writing a molecule. So when you see R or X, think attached to something, but we don't know what. Here's our first functional group, hydroxyl. A hydroxyl consists of an oxygen covalently bonded to a hydrogen, so hydroxyl. Let's identify them on a couple of other molecules. Here on the end of this carbon chain, there's a hydroxyl, an oxygen with a hydrogen. Here's another one on this molecule. Now, because we have sharing of electrons between an oxygen and a hydrogen, and because the sharing will be unequal, because the oxygen is very electronegative, hydroxyl groups are polar. Now remember that polar molecules like to mix with water, because water is also polar. Polar molecules like to mix with other polar molecules. So things with hydroxyl groups tend to be water soluble, at least partially. We find hydroxyl groups in molecules known as alcohols and in sugars. Let me show you a simple way to draw a hydroxyl group. Here we have an X, that's our unknown, an oxygen, a bond, a hydrogen. You can also abbreviate this as X connected to OH. Simple, hydroxyl. Here's an example of a molecule that's classified as an alcohol. Good old ethanol, drinking alcohol. Okay, here's its structure, and you can see that right here, there's a hydroxyl group. Now, because the hydroxyl group is attached to ethanol, that makes ethanol partially polar. Next, we have the carbonyl group, also known as the carbonyl group. I've heard it pronounced both ways. The key feature of a carbonyl group is a carbon with a double bond to an oxygen. Now, carbon can make 4 bonds, so 2 of the bonds go to the oxygen, and the other 2 go to 2 other things. And these can be any 2 other things. Here we have a molecule that has a couple of carbonyl groups. We have a carbon here, a carbon here and a carbon here. And you'll notice that this carbon has that double bond to the oxygen, and so does this one. So this has two carbonyl groups. Now, carbonyls can be called either ketones or aldehydes, depending on their position within a molecule. If they occur on the end of a molecule, like they do here, okay, notice there's nothing any bigger than a hydrogen attached to the end of this. So we call that the end of the molecule. We call that thing an aldehyde. If the carbonyl, on the other hand, appears in the middle of a chain, as this one does here, we refer to that type of molecule as a ketone. Here's the full word, ketone. So these are both different kinds of carbonyl groups. Carbonyl groups are polar, so they are hydrophilic. They are water soluble. They do like to mix with water. Here's how I like to draw a carbonyl group. We start with a carbon in the center. As it shows here, connect it to two X's, that's two of the bonds. Oh, I'm terrible at that. And then put a double bond to a nice fat oxygen on top. There you go. You may have heard of molecules known as ketone bodies. So what are they, and how do they relate to what we've just learned? Well, in general, ketones are molecules, all of which contain carbonyl groups, and they contain the carbonyl groups in the center of the molecule. So here, for instance, we have a ketone. And you notice that here's that carbonyl group. There's the carbon and that double bonded oxygen, and they are both in the center of the molecule. That's the case for all three of these ketones. All of these circled areas represent carbons. So they're in the middle of the chain. Now, ketone bodies are a special category of ketone molecules. Doctors often use them as an indicator for certain things going on in the body. They're produced by the liver when the liver breaks down fat for energy. And so when someone's on a special kind of diet, like a ketosis diet, you can find these in higher levels in the blood or in the urine. They're also associated in higher levels with diabetes type 1 because the body's having difficulty processing sugar, so it's relying more on fats. And when people have certain types of liver issues, such as cirrhosis or other issues that can be caused by alcoholism, that can cause a rise in ketone bodies too. So this is something doctors look for to help them diagnose certain characteristics. These are the three major types of ketone bodies that are observed. You don't have to memorize them, but if I put one on a test, you should know that that carbonyl represents a ketone. Here we have some examples of aldehydes. Aldehydes are molecules that contain carbonyl groups as well, but the carbonyl groups are found on the end of the carbon chain rather than in the middle. Now, what do I mean by on the end? Here we have a tiny, tiny carbon chain consisting of a single carbon, and you'll notice that there's a hydrogen on either side. It's the smallest thing you can attach to this chain. So even if there's a hydrogen on the end there, we consider this to be the end of the molecule. So that counts as an aldehyde. Over here we have a chain of several carbons, and you notice that this carbonyl on the end only has a hydrogen attached to its other side, so we consider this to be the end of the molecule. Therefore, this is an aldehyde. Here we have a really big weird one, and again, that carbon with the double bonded oxygen is on the tip end of this molecule. So those are aldehydes. Again, you don't have to memorize these specific ones, but if I put something like this on a test, you should be able to identify where the carbonyl group is and that it constitutes an aldehyde. Next, we have the carboxyl group. Now, if you take the two previous functional groups that we talked about, the carbonyl and the hydroxyl, and you combine them, you get the carboxyl. So the name kind of tells you what's involved. Carboxyl contains a carbon double bonded to an oxygen, that's the carbonyl portion, and then one of the bonds of the carbon in the center is going to be bound to a hydroxyl group. So that's carboxyl. Here on this molecule, we have the carboxyl here, again, the double bonded O, and the hydroxyl And then that carbon's going to be attached to a fourth thing, and it can be anything. Because the carboxyl group is a little complicated, sometimes you'll see it abbreviated as COOH, COO. So if you see that attached to a molecule, that's what it's talking about. Now, carboxyl groups are very polar. They are very hydrophilic, like the other groups we've talked about. They also are classified as acids. Now, why is that? Well, it's because they can exist in two forms, a non-ionized and an ionized form. Here's the non-ionized full form, and you'll notice that here's the little hydroxyl group. This hydroxyl group, under the right conditions, has the tendency to ditch its hydrogen. It'll kick that hydrogen out, and greedy oxygen will steal the electron from hydrogen. So hydrogen ends up being an ion, H+. Oxygen ends up having that negative sign. Now remember from chapter 3, anything that releases hydrogen into a solution is considered an acid. So this is why carboxyl groups are considered acids. Molecules that contain carboxyl groups are sometimes called carboxylic acids, and the ion that it produces is sometimes called a carboxylate ion. We find carboxyl groups in lots of places, but specifically we find them in amino acids and fatty acids, and that word acid should be a clue for you that it's probably got a carboxyl group. Here's how I like to draw a carboxyl group, and it's basically what the diagram shows up here at the top. You've got a carbon connected to something, an R or an X, connected to a double bonded oxygen here, connected to an OH, a hydroxyl group. There's your carboxyl. Here are a couple of examples of molecules that contain carboxyl groups. On the left-hand side, you've got lysine. Lysine is an amino acid, a building block of a protein. And if you look carefully, you'll see, oh, there's the carboxyl group. Carbon, double bonded oxygen, and a hydroxyl. On the right, we have a fatty acid. This is an important component of fats. And here's the ionized form of the carboxyl. If we added an H to the end of that and got rid of that negative sign, it might look more familiar. But that's a carboxyl group there as well. Next, we have the amine or amino group. Now, some of the previous functional groups were nice because their names kind of told you what atoms were involved. That's not the case with the amine amino group. The way that I remember what an amine or amino group contains is that these words contain the letter N, and the key component of an amine or amino is a nitrogen. So N for nitrogen, amine, amino has an N in it. An amino group consists of an NH2 or sometimes an NH3+, and we'll talk about that. So this is an amino group right here, NH2. Here's an NH2 as well. Those are amines. Now, amines or amino groups can act as bases. They are alkaline. Why is that? Well, remember, bases are proton acceptors. They take in hydrogen and remove it from solution. So here we can see it doing that. Here's the non-ionized form, the NH2, and it's going to rearrange its electrons in a tricky way so that it can take in this hydrogen and stick it onto itself. That gives us this ionized form. We get the plus sign because the hydrogen lacked an electron. So it becomes NH3+. Because it's removing hydrogen, it's acting as a base. Now, amino groups are hydrophilic. That means polar and water soluble. And we often find these guys in amino acids. In fact, that's what that word amino refers to. There are a couple of different ways to draw an amine or an amino group. Here's one way. You can have an X attached to an N. You can draw it to show the bonds between all the hydrogens if you like, and it will either be an NH2 or sometimes an NH3, and you put a plus, ooh, it's disappearing, on the nitrogen. An abbreviated way to draw this is just an X attached to an NH2 or an NH3+. Here are a couple of examples of molecules that contain amine groups. On the left we have lysine again, that's an amino acid. So the name amino acid should tell you that there's an amino group. And it's located right here. There's NH2. If you look closely, it also has one on the end of its carbon tail down here. There's an NH2 as well. On the right we have a molecule known as ATP. You're going to learn all about ATP. It's a major energy source for cells. But if you look at it really closely, it has an amine group here. Right there. Next we have the sulfhydryl group. As the name implies, this group involves a sulfur bound to a hydrogen, sulfhydryl. It's found on this molecule right here, and in this molecule down here, we see a sulfhydryl right there, sulfur and hydrogen. Now sulfur is not terribly electronegative, so we consider sulfhydryl groups to be slightly polar, but not really. They're right on the border between something that's hydrophilic and hydrophobic. It's okay to know that sulfhydryl groups don't attract water very well. Now, one of the interesting things that molecules with sulfhydryl groups can do is form disulfide bonds or disulfide bridges. Here we have two separate molecules that are doing that. The sulfurs have lost their hydrogens, and they are getting together and making a covalent bond. That's called a disulfide bridge. This is one of the major bonds that helps hold your proteins together. Molecules that contain sulfhydryl groups are sometimes called thiols. Sulfhydryl groups are really easy to draw. You just start with an R or an X attached to a sulfur, attached to a hydrogen. Or you can, ooh, that's terrible. You can abbreviate that as an X attached to a sulfur, attached to a hydrogen. You don't always have to show the covalent bonds between these two at the end. In this diagram, we have two cysteine molecules making a disulfide bridge. Cysteines are amino acids, and they happen to contain sulfhydryl groups. There's one. Here's another one on a separate amino acid right there. And you can see that they've lost their hydrogen, so they're making this disulfide bridge here. That's linking them together. The phosphate group is the largest and most complex functional group that we're going to look at. Here's its chemical formula, PO4 2 negative. And you can see that when it's drawn out, it does have a phosphorus in the middle that's surrounded by oxygens. It does tend to be anionic because at least one of those oxygens will have a negative symbol on it. Now, phosphate groups are hydrophilic, so they do like to mix with water. And they're especially important because they are very energy dense. They're used for energy storage in cells, particularly inside this molecule known as ATP, which we'll talk about more in Chapter 5. You can also find phosphate groups in DNA and in RNA. I'm going to show you a very simplified way of drawing a phosphate group. Now, this may not work for all chemistry classes, but it will work for us. You start with an X and a bond and the letter P. If it has a phosphorus atom in the middle, that's going to be a phosphate group for our purposes. We'll look at this in more detail in a later chapter. But for now, as an example, here we have a section of DNA that is laid out flat. And if you look very closely, you'll notice here's a phosphate group. Here's a phosphate group. Over here, there's another one. There's another one there. Phosphate groups are important inside DNA and RNA because they form the backbones of these molecules. They help hold everything together. Now, last but not least, we have the methyl group. Methyl groups consist of a carbon bound to 2 or 3 hydrogens, depending on how it's formed, and then it will be bound to something else. There's that R. Here we have a methyl group attached to this carbon ring. Now, methyl groups are the most common functional group in organic molecules because of that carbon. You find them all over the place. Methyl groups are not particularly reactive. They are not hydrophilic. In fact, they are very hydrophobic, very nonpolar. They tend to repel water. As with the amine or amino group, there are a couple of different ways to draw a methyl group. Always start with an X attached to a C. Oh, if I can do it quickly enough, H3, bond, bond, bond with a plus sign. Or you could abbreviate that XCH3. You could also show a CH2 in the same way. Here we have a couple of fatty acids. Fatty acids, as you can imagine, are very, very nonpolar, very hydrophobic. They do not like to mix with water. Why is that? Well, let's look at it. There's a methyl on the end of the chain. Here's a methyl, here's a methyl, here's a methyl, and so on. These are all methyl groups, and they are all nonpolar, so they don't like to mix with water. And that's the reason that fats and oils generally do not like to mix with water. You can see the same thing in this unsaturated fatty acid down here as well. Our last concept for this chapter has to do with isomers, what they are and how to identify them. So first of all, what the heck is an isomer? Well, isomers are molecules that have the same molecular formula but have different structures. So they have the same number and type of atoms, but they're arranged in different ways. Let's take a look at some isomers. First, we have structural isomers. Again, structural isomers contain the same number and type of atoms, but the bonds between those atoms are different so that you get two different structures. Here, for instance, we have two molecules. They have the same number and type of atoms, but they're arranged very differently. This one is arranged as a straight chain, whereas this one has a branch in it. Now, think about this for a minute. What is the chemical formula for this molecule, or for both of these molecules? Well, it's going to be C5, H1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, C5H12. You could call both of these molecules C5H12, even though they have different structures. Now, because they have different structures, they are going to behave differently inside living systems. Cis-trans isomers are also known as geometric isomers, and they have to do with the arrangement of atoms around a double bond in a carbon chain. So here, for instance, we have two carbons that are bound together with a double bond. Now, the formation of that double bond locks the atoms around the bond into place, so they can't move around once they're there. If the molecule has what we call the cis arrangement, then two of the things connected to the carbon will be on the same side of the double bond. If they have the trans arrangement, then those two things will be attached to opposite sides of the double bond. So cis is the same side, trans is opposite sides. Next, we have enantiomers. Enantiomers are a little bit difficult to describe on paper because they really have to do with the three-dimensional shape of the molecules. They are a type of what's known as stereoisomers. But essentially, enantiomers have three-dimensional structures and are mirror images of one another. So let's think about something that is a mirror image. Well, your hands are mirror images of one another. Take a look at your hands. Your hands have the same basic structures, but they're arranged differently. There's no way that you can put your hands together so that they take up exactly the same three-dimensional space. I mean, try it. Try putting the palms of your hands together. Well, the fingers kind of match up and the thumbs kind of match up, but the backs of the hands are facing away from each other. They're not taking up the same three-dimensional space because they're kind of oriented opposite. If you flip one of your hands over, well, now the backs and the fronts face the same directions, but the thumbs are sticking out on opposite sides. So there's no way that you can arrange your hands in space so that they take up exactly the same three-dimensional space. Enantiomers are the same way. If you look closely at these molecules, you'll notice there's no way you can turn them in space so they take up the same exact arrangement. Now, oftentimes these enantiomers are called left and right. L and D. D is dextral, which means right-sided. Or sometimes you'll see the L represented with an S, which stands for sinestral, which is another word for left. All of these enantiomers are going to be arranged around a central carbon, which is known as the asymmetric carbon. Scientists who design medications have to be very, very mindful of the existence of enantiomers. Even though these types of molecules are very similar to one another, they behave very differently in the body. For instance, here we have two examples of molecules that have enantiomers that behave differently. The top one is ibuprofen. Good old ibuprofen, it's a painkiller, it's an anti-inflammatory. It has a left and a right form. Only the left form is effective as a painkiller. The right form is not. We also have here albuterol. Albuterol is often taken for asthma. It's an anti-inflammatory. In this case, the right-handed form is the effective form. The left-handed form is not. So you really need to understand your enantiomers before you start giving chemicals to people. And the effects of different enantiomers can be very, very different. So you're almost done. Yay! This is your last year turn for chapter 4. On your guided notes, you should find some diagrams of molecules. I want you to look at those diagrams and decide whether they represent structural isomers, cis-trans isomers, or enantiomers, and label them as such. Then I want you to look very closely at those molecules. I want you to find one example of each functional group that we talked about and circle it and label it. Bring this with you to class and we'll look it over. Good job, you guys. We'll see you in class.